There was a 21-year-old man who loved to travel to exotic countries. After a while, he grew bored of the usual holiday destinations, and he wanted a trip that would be more exciting. His plan was to backpack around Southeast Asia for a few months. He thought that it would be a great experience to feel the freedom of traveling through remote areas, crossing mountains, and meeting random people along the way. His first destination was China. When his plane landed in Beijing, the only luggage he had was the small backpack he was carrying. However, the young man didn't want to stay for very long in the hustle and bustle of a huge Chinese city. He was eager to explore the hills and valleys of the vast country. The young man had an idea that he was sure would turn his little backpacking trip into a much more interesting adventure. He decided to randomly hop on a bus without having any idea where it was going. Not knowing the destination made it feel like he was taking a mystery tour around China. Every time the bus reached the end of the line, he would hop off and randomly catch another bus, never knowing or caring where it would take him. After a few weeks, he found himself traveling around some of the most remote regions in China. It was an area that tourists seldom visited. The man was delighted to be passing through all the tiny villages and having the opportunity to see how the rural Chinese people really lived. One day, he found himself traveling on yet another bus, passing through yet another remote area. When they set out, the bus was empty, but after 6 stops, a large crowd of people got on, and it was filled to capacity. After a while, he noticed that the other passengers kept looking at him strangely. The young man also thought it was odd that they chose to stand instead of sitting down in the vacant seat next to him. At the next stop, a beautiful Chinese woman boarded the bus. She looked around, and when she saw the young backpacker, her eyes suddenly grew wide with shock. When she hurried down the aisle and sat down beside him, he was a bit surprised. Suddenly, the woman nudged him and whispered, "Do you know where you are going?" "I have no idea," replied the man with a smile. "I'm just backpacking around the country. I got on this bus without looking at the destination." "Well, I must warn you that you are in grave danger," she said. "Why?" asked the man. "The next stop is the end of the line," said the woman. "It is a small village that has an awful reputation. The people who live there prey on Western tourists who become lost. They are cannibals." The man couldn't believe what he was hearing. At first, he thought she must be joking. When he looked at her face, he could not even detect the smallest hint of a smile. "Surely you can't be serious," he said. "What I am telling you is the truth," replied the woman. "If you are wise, you will take heed of what I tell you. Everyone in this area has heard the horrible tales of what goes on in this village. In my language, it's called the man-eating village." The woman's words shocked the young backpacker to his very core. He found himself lost for words. "If you don't believe me, just look around," she continued. "Almost all of the passengers on this bus are from that village." The young man looked up and realized that all of the other passengers were staring at him hungrily and licking their lips. "When the bus reaches the end of the line, you will be on their territory," said the woman. "No one will be able to save you. They will take hold of you and eat you alive." The backpacker broke out in a cold sweat. He could see the murderous look in the eyes of the slobbering Chinese villagers. He had to escape before the bus reached the village. Just then, he felt the bus begin to slow down as it ascended a steep mountain road. "This is our chance," said the woman. "Let's go." She grabbed him by the hand, and they ran down the aisle to the back of the bus before the other passengers had a chance to react. The woman pulled the handle of the emergency exit, and then jumped out. The backpacker was right behind her and leaped through the narrow opening. He crashed onto the dirt road, then rolled over and picked himself up. He saw the woman jump across a ditch and run off. He followed her, running as fast as he could. They escaped into the mountains as the angry yells of the other passengers echoed behind them. The man fled for his life, scrambling up the steep mountain slope, desperate to evade the hungry cannibals who were pursuing him. Eventually, the Chinese villagers gave up the chase and returned to the bus. The man was exhausted, but he was overjoyed that he had managed to escape their ravenous clutches. As he lay on a large rock, trying to catch his breath, he heard the woman laughing softly to herself. "Now I can eat alone," she said. This is a scary story from Russia about some horrible events during the siege of Leningrad in World War II. Today, the city of Leningrad is known as St. Petersburg. My grandfather came from Russia. He was born in Leningrad and lived there during World War II. When we were kids, he told us many stories about his own childhood. There was one story in particular that absolutely horrified me. He told it only once and refused to speak about it again, but he swore it was true. During World War II, in September 1941, the German army had surrounded the city of Leningrad and blocked off all the roads. Nobody could get in or out. They called it the Siege of Leningrad, and it was one of the longest and most destructive sieges in history. Hitler was determined to seize the city, and he didn't care how many buildings he had to destroy or how many innocent people he had to kill. In fact, his plan was to cut off all supplies and starve the entire population to death. After a year of this, over 100,000 people were dead, and the streets were littered with rotting corpses. At the time of the siege of Leningrad, my grandfather was only 6 years old. He lived in an apartment building near the center of the city with his mother and his 2 older sisters. At first, he said it was not so difficult, but then food began to run out. With each passing day, it became harder and harder to survive. There was barely anything to eat. Some days he managed to get a crust of bread, but other days he had to go hungry. The city was in chaos. People began eating animals and pets. They caught stray cats, dogs, rats, and so on, and ate them all. When there were no more animals left, cannibalism began. On the first floor of the building where my grandfather was living, there was 4 apartments. All of them were inhabited. My grandfather and his family lived in the first apartment. The second one was occupied by a woman and her 2 sons. The third was occupied by a man and his wife, and 2 middle-aged sisters who had never married were living in the fourth. One night, my grandfather was lying awake in bed, unable to sleep with the hunger. All of a sudden, he heard terrible screams and cries for help, which woke the whole family. It sounded like they were coming from one of the neighboring apartments. His mother's name was Zenata, and she was a very brave woman. She decided to check what was going on, despite the pleas of her frightened children. She gave them strict instructions to lock the door and not to open for anyone. She left, and the children did as they were told. Standing in the corridor, his mother noticed that the door of the next apartment was slightly ajar. This one was occupied by a woman who had 2 young sons. Zenata slowly walked to the door and cautiously peered inside. What she saw would haunt her for the rest of her life. Scared to death, she ran back to her own apartment and begged her children to let her back in. When my grandfather and his sisters opened the door, their mother burst in and slammed it shut behind her. She was out of breath and her face was pale. She got them to help barricade the door, and only then she would tell them what she had seen. On the floor, in a pool of blood, lay a severed hand, she said. There was a sickening stench of blood, and from the depths of the apartment I could hear disgusting chomping sounds. When they heard that, the older sisters became very upset. My grandfather was so terrified he ran to the bedroom and hid under the bed. The next day, when his mother went out into the corridor again to take a look around, she saw that the door of the next apartment was firmly closed. Everything was deathly silent. After several weeks, the situation in the city improved a bit. The Russian army managed to open up one narrow supply route, so some food was able to get through. None of my grandfather's family had died from starvation, but they were all very weak. One morning, his mother gathered together what little money they had and went to see if there was any food she could buy in the streets. When she came back, she noticed that the door of the third apartment was hanging on one hinge. This one was occupied by a man and his wife. Guessing what happened there, Zenaida pushed the door open and peeked inside. In the dim light, she could just make out 2 crumpled figures lying on the floor. Most of the meat had been stripped from their bones. Sick to her stomach, she returned to her own apartment. After telling her children the horrible news, she barricaded the door once again. However, they couldn't continue like this for long. Soon their meager food supplies had run out. They had to get more or they would certainly starve to death. Zenaida summoned the strength to get up and leave the apartment. No sooner had she taken a couple of steps down the corridor than she saw the door of the 4th apartment open. There were 2 middle-aged sisters living there, and one of them came out. The woman looked unusually good. All of the residents of the city were very thin and emaciated, but this woman looked healthy and even a little fat. The woman smiled and said, "Hello." Then she started walking towards Zenaida. Something about the woman's manner set her on edge, and she began to slowly back away. Looking over her shoulder, she caught sight of the 2nd sister, who was creeping up behind her. The woman was clutching a huge axe in her hands. Zenaida let out a strangled scream. She was trapped in the corridor and there was nowhere she could run. The 2 sisters were closing in, licking their lips in anticipation for their next meal. Salvation came unexpectedly. As it turned out, my grandfather's older sisters saw what was happening. At that very moment, a group of Russian soldiers were passing by on the street outside. The children opened the window and called out to them, screaming and begging them to come to the rescue. Without thinking twice, the soldiers ran into the entrance and quickly made their way up the stairs. When they came to the 1st floor, they saw the 2 fat women trying to drag a skinny woman into an apartment. The soldiers leveled their rifles and ordered the woman to stop fighting. The fat woman with the axe took a swing at the soldiers, and they shot her right between the eyes, blowing her brains out all over the wall. The soldiers ordered the other 2 women to lie down on the floor and began questioning them. Zenaida burst into tears and told them that the 2 sisters were cannibals. They had already eaten the inhabitants of 2 apartments and were about to eat the tenants of the 3rd. When the soldiers searched the other apartments and came across the half-eaten remains, they realized she was telling the truth. Then the soldiers rescued my great-grandmother and her family. They ordered the remaining sister to kneel down on the ground and executed her on the spot with a bullet to the back of the head. That was punishment for cannibalism at the time. A year later, the Russian army managed to push the Germans back, and the siege of Leningrad ended. Over 1,500,000 people had died, and another 1,500,000 had been evacuated. Somehow, my grandfather and his family managed to survive the whole thing. After all, those 2 fat sisters had a lot of meat on their bones. You made it to the end. Thank you guys for listening. If you guys like this content, please be sure to like and subscribe to help me grow my channel. Be safe out there.